gives me great pleasure now to open the scientific proceedings of this meeting. And our first speaker is Professor Andrew Levy. Professor Levy is Professor of Endocrinology at the Henry Wells Laboratory for Integrative Neurosciences and Endocrinology in Bristol. And his research interests are mainly in the area of pituitary tumorigenesis, and he has published widely in the field and attracted funding from several funding bodies such as the Wellcome Trust. His talk today is entitled Molecular and Trophic Mechanisms of Pituitary Tumorigenesis. And it's a sneak preview I had yesterday. Is anything to go by? I think we're in for a big treat this morning. Professor Andrew, thank you.
Nothing to disclose. May you live in interesting times is a really very interesting way to start the whole proceedings. It's actually a Chinese curse. So anyway, molecular and trophic mechanisms of pituitary tumorigenesis are very difficult, I think, to address directly. And in an intimidating circumstance such as this, I have this enormous desire to hide behind a description of this huge raft of proto-oncogenes and tumour suppressors and loss of heterozygosity and aneuploidy that have been described to account for them. But actually, to be honest with you, at the moment, the picture is really like this. There's no clear pattern that's emerged. There's nothing very compelling. And although there might be one or two real gems hidden in there somewhere, they are really resolutely hidden. Where are we? Well, I think the situation regarding the pathogenesis of pituitary adenomas is actually akin to our understanding of erectile function before we realised that nitric oxide isn't only found in the upper atmosphere. Now, if any of you are particularly disappointed by this and have travelled some distance to hear specifically about the pituitary, then can I commend to you these 4 reviews, which between them contain about 700 references or something for your bedtime reading. And they'll have the paradoxical effect either of putting you to sleep very quickly or keeping you awake as they have me. And if you have trouble getting any of them, if you email them, I'll be very happy to send them on to you. Now, there are a few clues. I shouldn't kind of abdicate the field completely, as it were, and move away. We know in somatotroph adenomas about 40% of them have a gain-of-function mutation of the GNAS, and they have exactly similar phenotype, really, pretty well, to the 60% that don't have them. And I put those pictures up just to remind myself what a difficult and unpleasant condition acromegaly is for many of our patients. We have multiple endocrine neoplasia, which you'll all be familiar with. And that is fascinating because it has a very similar spectrum of pituitary tumour phenotypes to sporadic adenomas, and also because 10% of them don't have the genotype. So this is not one case of an MEN1 with a classical phenotype but no genotype, not even 1%, but actually 10% of them. And I don't think that this is an artifact of just missing it on sequencing or anything, because it's 10%, and several groups have been looking. But only 1% of sporadic adenomas have any inactivating mutations. Carney complex we're familiar with, rarer still, 50% germline inactivating mutations of the signaling pathway for GHRH. Not surprising that you get some somatotroph adenomas. An aryl hydrocarbon receptor interacting protein gene, whatever that is, where you've got 16% of somatotrophs in northern Finland and probably a higher prevalence among people presenting early, but not often found in sporadic adenomas. And just very lastly, in this little section, isolated familial acromegaly, which we're familiar with. We've actually got some kindreds down in the southwest where I work. Autosomal dominant, incomplete penetrance, tends towards earlier disease, but again, it's hard to know whether that's an artifact of us looking, and also candidate gene near MEN1, but not MEN1, and familial isolated pituitary adenomas, incredibly rare, 15% with this aryl hydrocarbon receptor interaction mutation, and secretory phenotype similar to sporadic adenomas, but in the whole of southern Europe, there's probably about less than 140 individuals in all of these kindreds. So the real question is, where do we go from here? And I think what I'd like to do, if you don't mind, is go right back to the beginning and take a real different perspective in pituitary adenomas. And it's kind of refreshing to hear part of what Pfizer is able to do, and I'm not in their pay or anything at all, but I'm really quite jealous of the idea that they can just reinvent themselves and say, right, we're not going to do it like this, we're going to do it like that. We clinicians and scientists seem to just collect everything. We just collect and collect. And I want to just push it all to one side and just take us right back to the beginning. And for me, I have to admit to you, and it might be too small to see at the back, but it's a journey from knowing almost everything to knowing next to nothing. And I remember when I started in the 1980s and early 90s, it really seemed that we were on the brink of knowing everything about pituitary tumours and it would be sorted out. And now, I really feel that we just don't know. And we're glued to the ground in a kind of a mess of different things, none of which are very compelling. Why do I say that? Well, they stop growing. And I just don't think we can ignore the fact that they just stop. If we look in all of you now, at least 10% of you will be harbouring a microadenoma. By the time you die, it's probably more than that, maybe 17%. These are quite modest analyses. So occult adenomas at least in 10 or 15% of the population, and yet the prevalence of clinically overt adenomas is, what, 1 in 5,000? So that means that already 99.8% of them go through a period of trophic instability, and then they stop. Okay, of those that actually do present, half of them come at the microadenoma stage. So that makes 99.9% of all the pituitary adenomas that we know and love just don't persistently grow. And even of those very few remaining ones which occupy us in clinic all the time, and which are the ones that we think typify pituitary adenomas but clearly don't, only a fraction of those go to surgery. And if they do grow, and they're the ones that we always think of, if you think pituitary adenomas, you think of these few that grow, they do so very, very slowly. In our country, we have the NHS, which has actually got a lot of targets now. We can replace hips completely routinely within 18 weeks. We see people with potential tumours within 2, always. It's a miraculous health service, actually. But pituitary tumours don't figure in that, because somehow we just don't consider them as tumours, quite rightly. They don't have molecular characteristics of tumours. We've looked at P53, which is supposed to be an almost universal marker. It's just not there. And they don't accumulate increasing loss of heterozygosity in time. One imagines, if you've got a tumour, that as time passes, it will get more and more peculiar in its kind of genetic makeup. That doesn't happen. And in those cases where it's been possible to take a nibble from it with surgery and then a few years later have another nibble, there's no increase in heterozygosity. Indeed, some of the originally spotted heterozygosity seems to have gone. So either the techniques that we use and published are not very secure, or another clone must have grown. But they don't get nastier. We send people away, I'm sure you do, for years at a time before we review them, and we don't worry and we don't need to. They can be cyclical. The hormone phenotype can exist without the architecture. You're all familiar with Cushing's. It's something that I particularly specialise in. But it's not at all unusual to have complete normal MRI scan with absolutely unequivocal Cushing's disease, pituitary-dependent hypercortisolemia, behaving cyclically maybe, and the surgeon goes in, looks fairly normal, takes out a bit of something which looks fairly normal under the microscope, and the patient's in remission. Well, what is that? And they almost never metastasize, and some of them just go away. I mean, what kind of a self-respecting oncogene would be so modest in its malignant aspirations that it would just say, okay, I've had it, I'm off, I'm going. And they just go away. That's 15% of microprolactinomas. It goes up to 1 in 3 after a pregnancy. So yes, you know, they're tumours like this is a bicycle, but there's something not quite right about it. And the same with this, you know, which is clearly a locomotive, but the more you look at it, you think, well, I know it's a locomotive, but it's not quite right in so many ways. Now, it's not just us, of course. Canine Cushing's and canine pituitary disease is very common, and this dog, whose owner has carefully protected its identity when it was put up on the internet, has got Cushing's. And horses too, very common equine Cushing's. Very strange, you get dramatic osteoporosis, the back, dramatic kyphosis, the hair gets longer, they almost turn into yaks almost. And bizarrely, and slightly unfortunately perhaps, our typical model, our rodent model of pituitary disease are very prone to spontaneous adenomas. Now, these are all, as you recognise, rat pituitaries, and these are normal. This is 15-month-old Sprague-Dawley rats, and look at them, absolutely riddled with tumours, and they haven't been smoking or doing anything untoward. Look, tumours, several of them here and here and here. More than one, and this one's got 3. And if you just look under the microscope at some of these, there's an a tumour here, a tumour there, another tumour here. Not unusual, different phenotypes, all growing away. That's the edge of this one, and that's the edge of this one over here. So are they really tumours? That's what I want to pose to you. Are they really tumours? Are we going to get anywhere by continually looking at them from that point of view? But will clonality tell us? That's always been, people say, look, I don't care. I don't care how they behave. If they're monoclonal, they're tumours. And sure enough, many pituitary tumours, or most of them that have been looked at, have got clonal skewing or they're monoclonal. But there are some technical pitfalls with clonality, which I'm sure you're aware of. There's sample size and patch size. And these 2 little lumps of tissue, this one's polyclonal at the single cell level, and the one on the right is polyclonal but with little patches. Take a big nibble, and it'll both be polyclonal. But if you take a little nibble like that, you can see that one of them will appear to be clonally skewed while the other one isn't. And there are assumptions. We make assumptions. Clonality is during early embryological life, clonality is assigned, and then all the daughter cells of all of those embryological cells have kind of go true as far as their clonal distribution. And we assume that migration and dispersal of cells is going to lead to a mosaic at the single cell level, and that also, once we've been formed, we don't refresh ourselves, we don't renew things, we're not really undergoing any slightly clonally orientated changes in mitotic or apoptotic activity. So are we polyclonal at the single cell level? Well, it turns out we're not. And a little while back there was a brilliant paper by some very excited and excitable cardiologists who were looking at a smooth muscle in aortic plaques, in atherosclerotic plaques in the aorta. And they discovered that they were monoclonal, and they thought, that's fascinating. Malignancy, that kind of mechanism plays a part in the formation of atherosclerotic plaques. And they published this paper, and it was a thrilling paper. And then about a year or 2 later, they published another one, where instead of the first time, they used as a control a bit of what they thought was normal aorta, and looked at the smooth muscle there, and lo and behold, that was monoclonal too. And they realized after a bit that the smooth muscle in the aorta and the endothelium as well is actually polyclonal, but that it's not at the single cell level. There are little patches, little tessellations, which are actually about 4 millimeters square. Same with uterine muscle, same with normal liver, same with regenerative hepatic nodules. We're all familiar with the liver regenerating and forming, but they're monoclonal. It's not tumour, is it? The bladder urothelium may be made by 200 or 300 cells, each of which expands to form about a centimetre square of the lining of the bladder. Breast ducts, corneal keratocytes. And this cat, if you'll recognise it's a tortoiseshell cat, actually has one coat colour from its mother and one coat colour from its father. So these are clonal patches that you're looking at in its skin. You're not looking at anything else, and yet it's clearly not got a malignant kind of skin condition. It's just a normal tortoiseshell cat. And it occurred to me a while back that it might be that if you had some clonal architecture in the pituitary, now this is a schematic of the pituitary here, and all of these different shapes are supposed to represent corticotrophs, for example, but each different shape is a different clone. So they're all corticotrophs, but they have a bit of a territory, if you like. Each clone is giving rise to a bit of a territory. You can imagine if I took a little nibble from here and analysed it, it would be truly polyclonal because of all of the other secretory cell types interspersed. But if there was some, just imagine there was some physiological trophic influence that actually made those cells divide more than other cells, it might be like this. And if I took another nibble now, perhaps it would have displaced other cells. And you might get clonal skewing, which is nothing less than clonal skewing from a physiological trophic phenomenon. Do you see what I mean? It's not necessarily implying a malignant process. Perhaps. I don't know. But in summary, pituitary tumours, I think you'll agree, this is where I'd like to take Pfizer's trick and say, right, we're not doing it like that anymore. Very common, very benign. They're qualitatively normal the way they behave. When we diagnose Cushing's, we say, is it doing what it should do, but a bit more of it? We don't say it's doing something bizarre. They don't develop increasing mutations over time. They don't even look like it. Down a microscope, I don't know if you've looked at it, but sometimes the reticulin's a bit disturbed. But otherwise, the cells are just normal. They just look normal. So we don't have typical molecular characteristics of tumours. The vast majority, 99.9% or more, stop growing of their own accord, and some of them just go away. We have a saying in the UK, if it looks like a duck and it quacks, it's likely to be a duck. And for some reason with pituitary tumours, it really doesn't look like a duck. And sure, it doesn't quack. And we're saying, but they're tumours. And that's where we are at the moment and the way we're kind of always moving forward. So what I want to do is just kind of change tack a little bit and say to you, look, is it possible that what we call pituitary tumours are actually a consequence of the normal behaviour of the pituitary? Now that's okay, but then we have to try and work out what the normal behaviour of the pituitary is. Now you know, for example, that in pregnancy, if you take a virgin and an animal or a human that's had a pregnancy, the pituitary is a little bit larger. I mean, could it be that the pituitary responds to a transient stimulus trophically, but when that stimulus has passed, it doesn't quite get back to how it was before? And maybe that's a mechanism that it wants to exhibit. Maybe what you're looking at is real plasticity, and the pituitary of a woman that's been pregnant in the past is ready for another pregnancy. It's all ready to go. It's kind of changed the way that it's structured so that it'll be more able to cope with another pregnancy. Maybe it's completely normal. And what we're looking at with pituitary tumours is not benign malignancy as much as exuberant normality, if you see what I mean. So what is normal pituitary behaviour? Can we find out? Now that's a real trick. And we think, well, we know that, we do immunochemistry, and I'll just take you through a bit of that. We can certainly look at it, and those top two pictures have got mitotic figures, and the bottom two have got apoptotic bodies, and we can see them. We don't need to stain, we don't need to fiddle around, we don't need to extract, we just look. So let me show you this little experiment, a little experimental paradigm, a little strategy. This is Alison, that's her pituitary. She's driving her adrenals, as you know, to make cortisol, and that feeds back and inhibits her pituitary, or keeps it in check. If we take out her adrenals, no cortisol, no feedback inhibition, ACTH goes up, as we know. The pituitary might get a little bit bigger, we think it does, and the number of corticotrophs increases. That's the dogma. That's what we believe happens. Now, if that does happen, how does it happen? Is it that new corticotrophs are formed by corticotroph division? That makes so much sense, isn't it? You've got a population that's doing the thing you want, you divide, and you've instantly got more of the ones that are doing what you want. Could it be that cells that aren't corticotrophs die? That would increase the proportion of corticotrophs. Perhaps non-functioning cells become corticotrophs. They differentiate. They take this key, this time to differentiate. Maybe cells trans-differentiate. Maybe somatotrophs feeling very left out when you take the adrenals out, say, I'm fed up being a somatotroph, I'm going to do something more useful, I'm going to become a corticotroph. That is a mechanism which we all believe happens. If you read the literature, there's buckets of literature telling you that trans-differentiation occurs. Could it be that we just can't see them, and that when they're pepped up a little bit and the amount of hormone they contain, they appear immunochemically? That could well be the case. Could it be that cells are actually totipotent, but just keep all that portfolio of activity hidden until they need it, and then they actually show you? Or is it an illusion? Is it just an illusion? And I want to show you some illusions. This is my favourite. These two tabletops are the same. And I know with lots of illusions, people say things like this, the kind of line with the arrows going in and the arrows going out, and you say, oh yeah, I can see. If you really look at this, really look at those two tabletops, do they look the same to you? They sure don't to me, even if you study them and study them. And it's our minds which are actually changing them to make them look the same. If I swing the tabletop of one to the other, I mean, this is a smart computer, but I can't change the size. They are the same. And the literature is absolutely packed with illusions and misinterpretations, and we can't seem to get rid of it. And a little while back, this article came out in JCEM. Here it is, extensive clinical experience, 85 to 2005. I thought that's just up my street. I'm going to look at that. It's 100 cases in those 20 years. That's about my experience as well. And when you look through thinking, now I'm going to really find out what acromegaly does, it's got things like this. Here we are. The most common problem leading to the diagnosis was acral changes followed by headaches. Amenorrhea, 6% of total, 11% of women. And it kind of, I know what they mean, but it kind of makes you laugh and wonder at the same time, doesn't it? You think, well, yes, menstruation is unusual in men, it's true. But then if you think, there's no mention, I don't want your clinical experiences, there's no mention of obstructive sleep apnea. Of course not. It wasn't really recognised back then. And in my practice, it's things like obstructive sleep apnea, which are a plague The major symptom of acromegaly, carpal tunnel, arthritis, obstructive sleep apnea, dysmorphophobia, not even mentioned. So it's difficult. So just going back to these illusions again, all you've got to do, if you want to see whether cells are changing in number, obviously, is count them up. It's easy enough. Here's a nice slide with some cells, dispersed cells. It couldn't be more straightforward. So all we've got to do is to count them. You think, well, that's easy. Look, there's 2 there, there's 1 there, there's 1 there. Well, it looks like probably 2. I think you might agree there's probably 2 there. What's that green blob? I don't know. Is it just me who gets slides with green blobs on? It's got a green blob. What about that one? Is that one? Or isn't it? What about that? Is that one that's dying? Is it a cell? Do you count it? Don't you? If very tiny changes make very dramatic differences in what we believe the pituitary does, then we need to sort it out. And it's difficult. Okay, so you've got to count the proportion of different cell types. So what do? You background stain it. You counter stain. Okay, this is TSH in the pituitary, and you can see the ones that stain, and you can count the proportion of them. There's one. There's another one. But what about all these beige ones? Do any of you do immunochemistry and get beige? I mean, are they in or are they out? And I think, I'm not really sure. I know, I'll develop it for a bit longer. I'll put a bit more antibody on, a bit more concentrated. And what happens is that they go brown, and all these ones go beige. And you end up thinking, I really don't know. And it's a major problem, because our whole understanding of the pituitary, I mean, it is kind of comical. But it's also a little bit frightening, because our whole basis of what we think the pituitary does is based on this stuff. So which cells are positive here? Now what I've done is to draw a load of cells on a luminance staircase underneath it. And I can tell you that the cells that I've drawn are all identical in optical density. Absolutely identical. So I would say to you that if you did immunochemistry and you were looking at this, and you can imagine the staircase behind it is just counterstain, which has gone a bit wonky, then the top left one is definitely positive. That's a TSH cell if ever there was one, and the one at the top right is definitely negative. But if you slide that across, you'll see that they're absolutely identical. And it's not a matter of honesty. It's a matter of not being able to overcome our brain processing of what we're seeing. The same with these chess pieces. Look, white chess pieces on the top, black on the bottom. And if any of you saw this in Nature a few months ago, you'll see that actually they're not black and white chess pieces. They're identical. And the only reason that they look so compellingly black and white is because the background has changed. And if you look at the rook down there in the bottom left corner, I'll take a segment of it and slide it up to the one on the top. It changes, and the same with the king here. Slide it up to the top, it's the same. And I hardly need to tell you now that squares A and B are absolutely identical in optical density. And what your brain is doing is compensating for the virtual shadow cast by the non-existent cylinder on the right. And you just can't overcome this. And yet we publish stuff as if this doesn't happen. And we cross our hearts with being very honest, and we just ignore it. There, going from one to the other. If we ignore all that, and let's pretend that we can actually count and be reliable, is counting reliable? Well, this is ACTH, and the brown ones are BRDU. But look, I mean, how many are here? How many would you say are there? It just is impossible to say. CRH cells tend to clump. I don't know if growth hormone cells and prolactin cells really clump, but they're just so numerous that they're always touching. It's very, very difficult to count these. Okay? And this, even if we can count, is reliable counting reliable? Well, it isn't. If a cell gets bigger, and you extrapolate from a count in a 2D section to a 3D volume, what happens is that you overestimate it. If you imagine a basin, for example, with a big basketball in it and 99 ping pong balls, every section you take through the basin, you're going to get a piece of basketball. It's going to be hugely overrepresented. And I know that that's a very gross example, but even a small change in cell volume will dramatically change your count. So unless you do the maths to correct it, you're up a gum tree again. And you will overestimate if a cell gets bigger. And of course, all activated cells get bigger. That was known at the turn, in early 1900s. That, if you want to see if a cell is activated, according to trend is activated, it will just become bigger. So what I would say to you, and I hate to say this, but the quantitative immunochemistry just isn't. And if any of you have looked through the abstracts of this meeting, you'll find something where they've actually said, a sample of only 30 or 40 patients, they're giving differences in immunochemistry to a decimal place. very, very difficult to actually justify, but adds to now 701 references rather than just 700 for your delectation. Very difficult. Can we do anything? I'm being terribly downbeat. I apologise. Can we do anything? Can we really get some information? Well, we can. These are crocuses from which, of course, you get colchicine. And if you get a rat, on the top left, and you give it an injection of colchicine at time 0, and then you kill groups of rats which have been injected with colchicine at intervals, colchicine will arrest formation of the way it gets through metaphase. So cells will go around the cell cycle and get stuck in metaphase and they'll build up. So if you get rats and you kill groups of them at different times, 1.5 hour intervals after giving them colchicine, it's a very old method, statinokinetic, and then you take the pituitaries and you count directly, no immunochemistry, the number of mitotic figures, you can get a rate. And that's the rate at which the cells in that pituitary are undergoing mitosis. And what you'll notice, firstly, the bottom left, where it crosses the y-axis, is like about 0.1 or less than 0.1% of cells. So it's 1 in 1,000. And yet when you look at that rate, when you look at the slope of the line, it's actually coming out about 2.7% per day. And this gives you a little bit more information as well, because if you extrapolate back to the baseline, that where it crosses the baseline is telling you the visible duration of the phenomenon. So in this particular pituitary, 2.7% of the cells in it every day undergo mitosis, but you only see them do it for about 90 minutes. About 90 minutes they're giving you a flash of kind of mitotic figures. That's it, you don't see anything else. So it's doing a lot, but you can't really see it, okay? So what happens in the normal male rat? Well, interestingly, as they get older, you get a dramatic decrease in cell turnover. So in a 6-week-old animal, the rate of cell turnover is enough to entirely replace its pituitary every 37 days. Okay, these are real data. By 3 months, it's gone down to 63 days, 6 months, 121, and by 15 months, when of course they're riddled with tumours, it's virtually stopped, which is really quite interesting. Is it different in males and females? If you look in the literature, it implies that female pituitaries are much more active than males. There's certainly a much bigger scatter, but that's all it is. And if you look over 2 weeks at net trophic activity, it's exactly the same in males and females. And it's the fluctuating levels of estrogen. I won't bore you with this, it's a bit busy. But the top left there, you can see the standard error bars are bigger in an intact female than they are if you take the ovaries out and you give back a low dose of estrogen. So fluctuating levels of estrogen have a very dramatic short-term effect in mitotic activity in the pituitary, but no longer-term effect. And it is no longer-term effect. I think because of Fisher 344 and a few particular peculiar rats, we've always been terribly worried about estrogen in the pituitary and about prolactinomas and things like that, on the basis that estrogen, it's mean, it's powerful, it'll keep stimulating turnover, and it doesn't. This is after a week, you get an increase. This is very high dose continuous estrogen in a rat. You get an increase in turnover. But if you give high dose continuous estrogen for a month, it really is completely back down to normal if you compare that with this. So even high dose estrogen, the pituitary will get fed up with it and just say, no, I'm sorry, I'm not changing anymore. But surely, if you look at the literature, and you think we just must know this, what the pituitary does in pregnancy, surely there's a change from somatotroph dominance in a virgin to lactotroph dominance, prolactin cell dominance in an animal which is pregnant or lactating. We know that. That's the dogma. That must happen. If it does happen, then lactotrophs must be dividing during pregnancy and dying at weaning, or somatotrophs must be dying at the beginning and then dividing at weaning, or one's turning into the other, or bihormonal cells are seesawing. It's exactly the same kind of picture once again. Maybe inactive cells are differentiating pregnancy. It doesn't. Maybe it doesn't. Nothing changes. And if you look back through the literature, you'll find these very famous people in the field who are saying, oh, there's massive cell death here, there's massive necrosis here, yes, there's lots of cell division. No, there isn't. There really isn't. And it's part of the whole dogma of the thing that it really doesn't seem to change. If anything changes, the cell sizes change to give you that artifact. Anyway, going back to Alison and the corticotrophs appearing to increase in size, we took the adrenals out. You remember we get rid of feedback and you increase ACTH and pituitary size. So can we do that in an animal? Well, we can. In a rat. It's a nice experiment. You just adrenalectomize a lot of animals and you kill groups of them at intervals after that. And this is what you see, very repeatedly. This little M-shaped wave, very, very modest, of increased mitotic activity after adrenalectomizing the animal. If you give dexamethasone, a powerful synthetic glucocorticoid, you can actually suppress mitotic activity compared with baseline. At the same time, apoptosis is creeping along at the bottom, doesn't really change, but with dexamethasone you get this amazing little very tight burst of cell death. And we've done this again and again and again, looked at the shoulders of it, the 24-hour delay and then a burst of cell death. Looks like nothing, goes up to 0.25% of the cells present, 1 in 400. And yet, if all of that occurs in corticotrophs, which it doesn't, that will completely obliterate the corticotroph population. These look like nothing, but they're very, very major transient changes in the way the pituitary is dealing with things. It's very active. What if we adrenalectomize them, wait 2 weeks, give dexamethasone for 2 weeks, take it away, and then take it away again? Well, what happens is you get another little M-shaped wave. Here it is, a little M-shaped wave of mitotic activity. You give dexamethasone back, you get another little wave of apoptosis, a little wave of cell death. It happens again. Now those cells, of course, can't have been there before because they would have died here with dexamethasone. So they've actually been generated by this little burst of mitotic activity. And actually, if you give BRQ at that point, then you can show that the increase with adrenalectomy is completely blocked or completely destroyed again by dexamethasone. So it's the young cells which are actually the ones that respond to these things. It's not like us. We're not born, get old, then die. These are cells that are born and die. They're born and then they die. And if they survive that, then they just seem to go on almost interminably. Do newly formed cells have hormonal identity? The answer is no. Newly formed cells really don't. And this slide, which you've seen before, is one of the very, very rare cells which I've had to show you twice, where actually it does look as if this BRDU positive cell has got ACTH in the cytoplasm. It's very unusual. It's very unusual for hormonally distinctive cells to actually divide. Does timing matter? Does it matter when you do this? If you adrenalectomize an animal and wait a bit longer, does it matter when you give the steroid? It does. That's after a week. If you do it before a week, it gradually increases. So it's adding reactive cells to this population. At 1 week it's big. At 2 weeks it's still big. If you wait a month, by a month it's gone right back down to the little wave you see in an intact animal. So timing is absolutely crucial in the pituitary as well. And how does it do it? Well, there are 2 ways it could do it. As far as the pituitary is concerned, if you take out the adrenals, CRH goes up, and maybe that's what's doing it. And if you read the literature, you'll know. There's no doubt CRH is supposed to be trophic. I'm sure if we had a show of hands, they'd all go up. Or is it withdrawal of corticosteroid inhibition? Well, you can do this experiment by disconnecting the hypothalamus. You just cut round the PBN, you leave the blood supply intact, you leave the arcuate nucleus intact and the suprachiasmatic nucleus intact. You leave everything intact. You just cut round the PBN and get rid of CRH. So what do you think happens? Well, that's an intact animal there. And if you disconnect the PBN, in other words, this is looking at mitotic activity in the pituitary after you've disconnected CRH. There's no CRH influence. If anything, it's gone up. Although it's not really any different. If you adrenalectomize them, as you know, you get an increase in mitotic activity. And if you do both, adrenalectomize in an animal where you've disconnected the CRH, it goes up even more, or at least it's about the same. So CRH is not trophic. However, it does control POMC transcription and ACTH secretion. And it turns out that CRH has no trophic effects at all. Under maximum physiological non-pregnant conditions, CRH is not trophic. The pituitary response to adrenalectomy is entirely and absolutely mediated by withdrawal of tonic inhibition of circulating glucocorticoids. But that has nothing to do with ACTH. It's the CRH which is controlling ACTH, which is rather beautiful because it allows a transient trophic response to accompany a prolonged secretory response. What about testosterone? Just to show you a little bit about the portfolio of what the pituitary does. If you take the testes away from an animal, you get this wave of increased mitosis, peaks at about 4 days, very modest, and goes down again. If you actually give back dihydrotestosterone, you can rapidly bring mitotic activity down to baseline. Same really if you give testosterone, and that extra wave is because it's being aromatized to estrogen. And we know that changes in estrogen will cause that. If you give testosterone with an aromatase inhibitor, exemestane or letrozole or something, it blocks that. Okay, so mitotic activity in the pituitary is normally tonically inhibited by circulating testosterone. So you think, right, this is easy. We'll adrenalectomize an animal, we'll castrate it too, and we should get an even bigger response. Well, that's the effect of adrenalectomy, which you've already seen. This is the wave of mitosis at 3 days and 6 days. That's if you gonadectomize an animal, you take the testes away, up it goes again. You do both together, and it's exactly the same. And it's the same population of cells, almost certainly, that are responding both to removal of testosterone and removal of glucocorticoids. And in fact, if you gonadectomize, if you take the testes away from a rat, and then after 2 weeks you give it some dexamethasone, you get a big burst of apoptosis, just the same. So there's one group of cells that are really busy watching out for everything in the pituitary, a subgroup of population, subgroup of cells. So finally, just the last few slides, just to try and go over what I've been explaining. To my way of thinking, pituitary tumours are not tumours, mostly. And a few of them are, of course they are, but all of our huge body of literature driving us down that pathway is not amounting to terribly much, and I don't think it will. There's a big epigenetic side to it, absolutely, it's controlling, if not induction of whatever this is, but propagation and stopping the propagation in time. But this is the model that we've got. We've got active oligopotent stem cells in the pool. About 1% or less of cells in the pituitary are active oligopotent cells. Just like a little car engine idling, it's continually popping out new daughter cells in asymmetrical division. And those new daughter cells here are dying. They just appear on the scene, look around, see that they're not really wanted, and that's it, they've gone again. And at the same time, this oligopotent stem cell pool is actually in equilibrium with an inactive pool. And as the animals get older, more and more of the cells go up the hill with increasing age. So what happens is, and always these cells are tonically inhibited by circulating testosterone and corticosteroid. And at the same time, they're stimulated by estrogen in the short term, and actually also by thyroid hormones. And I know this is a bit paradoxical, but if there are no thyroid hormones, you block all of these responses. And if you give extra thyroid hormone to an intact animal, mitotic activity actually increases. It's very difficult to see how that fits in with our experience of hypothyroidism and increased pituitary size. We don't know yet. But anyway, that's what happens. If you adrenalectomize these animals, the transient amplifying cells, their products don't undergo apoptosis. They divide a little bit more, and this is what gives us this little M-shaped wave of mitotic activity that produces nascent null cells. They are null. They are not producing any hormone. But at the same time, the same stimulus is making the mature null cell differentiate into hormone-secreting cells, we think. And as far as the hormone-secreting cells themselves actually dividing, well, maybe less than 5% of the total change in cell numbers, and the cell number changes are very, very, very tiny. If you give glucocorticoids, the transient amplifying cells again follow the pathway down to immediate apoptosis. The nascent null cells, do you remember within the first couple of weeks, but not after a month, that body of cells are very susceptible to dexamethasone-induced apoptosis. And at the same time, it actually is one of the only things we've found which will drive active oligopotent cells to the inactive state. So how do corticosteroids, this was the question I posed at the outset, I'm not sure I can answer it, how does this happen? Well, if it happens at all, some nascent but mature non-functioning cells take the opportunity to differentiate. New corticotrophs are formed by corticotrope division. A very, very small proportion of cells actually do that. They're in the literature, but there's very few. It might be that committed cells cross detection thresholds of immunochemistry, and I have no idea. And I cannot see how anybody could do an experiment to find out. Perhaps nascent non-functioning cells don't die. That does happen, and if anything, that should actually reduce the number of corticotrophs, one would have thought. They don't, it's an illusion. And I think, like a lot of things in the pituitary, it is smoke and mirrors. It's smoke and mirrors made worse by immunochemistry and people not understanding that you just can't use it. We're just driven towards this. We've got to turn grant money into papers, and we just go at it hell for leather, and you can't really turn around and say, actually, I don't really think this is right. Old cells that aren't corticotrophs die, well, that would actually increase the proportion of corticotrophs. That doesn't happen. There's no wave of apoptosis. And cells really don't seem to change their function. I've not had time to tell you about our studies of transdifferentiation, which doesn't really exist, but it really doesn't seem to happen. So in summary, ladies and gentlemen, just the last couple of slides, pituitary tumours occasionally slowly increase in size or regress, but most of them, huge majority, stop growing altogether. There's some evidence, I think, that they're oligoclonal, not monoclonal. But, the publication bias, you could never publish such a thing. And I think derivation from a single trophically unstable cell is extremely unlikely. The normal pituitary has got this wonderful, specific portfolio of responses that it's coming up with all the time. I even think that cells probably move around in it. I mean, any of you who've dispersed pituitary tumours and had them will see them moving around. You have the beautiful monodispersal. The next day you come in and they're all in a tree in the corner. And they're actually able to move around. And pituitary cell population is mediated by nascent cell apoptosis. It's all neonatal and infant mortality. It's like an obstetric hospital like the Somme. If you get out of there alive, you live. And it's not old folks' homes and old people's homes that are doing the problem. And this is what we've got. We've got the phenotypes without the genotype. 10% of MEN1, 50% of Carney. We've got the phenotypes without an adenoma. All of those Cushings where you have to do proposal sinus sampling and there's still nothing to see. Spontaneous resolution of adenomas like microprolactinomas, which we're all very familiar with. 1 in 3 of them will do that after pregnancy. Transient trophic disequilibrium. In the vast majority, if they do anything abnormal, they do it transiently and then they go back to normal. And that all implicates some kind of epigenetic mechanism, which we've not even begun to scratch. Because histone codes and methylation is such a black box at the moment, we just don't understand the language. So very lastly, cellular turnover persists like an idling engine. New cells commit suicide if they're born during a period of no change. Young cells, but not older cells, respond to change by dying, dividing, or differentiating. New cells are always non-secreting. Okay, they just don't do anything at all. Stimuli that cause cell population to increase do so by making existing cells differentiate. So it's the middle-aged cells that really do it. Now, all I can say is I don't think it was a bang on the head that made Fred grow to 8'4", but it's close to me thinking that that's about as good as we know at the moment. And I think this is what we've been doing. So thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Professor Levy for a wonderful talk. I think that sets the scene for the rest of the meeting.
I need to tell you that your talk was the best.
Thank you very much.
Was the best. It was a pleasure to hear you. Really.
Very sweet of you.
Really,
Thank you.
everything. As you talk, your slide, everything was just great.
Very kind.
I saw you and said, wow. And, that's why I wanted to tell you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I enjoyed your talk very much.
Thank
You were incredibly funny.
Oh, on purpose, I hope?
It worked, but it was on purpose. I suppose it was on purpose.
Yes, usually people laugh when I don't mean it to be funny, and they don't laugh when I do. But
They're very well crafted. You're a great storyteller.
thank you. Thank you very much.
Hi.
Hello.
I enjoyed your lecture.
Oh, thank you very
It
much.
was very good.
I just wanted to say, as an English person, that we would like your autograph and we would like you to do the British Society lecture on Boxing Day. As children, you made your subject so easy, and I thought I have to check out this man. He's got a bit of humour, he's cynical, he's got the gift of the gab. It was lovely, wasn't it? Did you like it?
Oh, from that point of view, no. I'd have rather been anywhere in the world than standing up there.
Your voice is going.
No, it's the same.
Is it?
Yeah, this is how it is.
Is it?
Yeah, I'm afraid so.
But keep going. What's the one on New Year's Day? Is it the Royal Institution's lecture?
the Christmas lectures.
I mean, presumably at your age, you've got your Blue Peter badge.
I've got a silver one.
Yeah, and you see, we knew that, you little brainy shit that you are. And so we could see that you were just going for the Royal Institution lectures.
The Christmas lectures.
I'm a fan, I'm stalking him.
I've got...
Not aware that I'm from St Bartholomew's, and I am the growth hormone nurse specialist. If that is a title,
That's very sweet.
I have to come and speak to Mr. Levy.
Because Marta Corbin is never going to speak to me again.
She is. Because I'm going to say, we love that man. We want him for children. Have you got children?
Yes, I have 3, thank you, plenty.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't want to have children.
Not anymore.
Oh, exactly,
no?
That's right.
Damn.
But
things are going well for a moment.
Take care and safe journey.
Thank you.
Lovely.
That was surreal. Where were we?